Everyone, this is Tarun from Classify, and we are pleased to bring you a webinar con covering the concept of the important subject of data discovery and data classification. Are you doing it right? Is the question that we will be asking all throughout this webinar, and probably while you have a look at the agenda, we intend covering the following subject as far as this webinar is concerned. We look at what is that subject definition of data classification, look at the definition of a data classification policy, and how does a data classification policy look like for an organization. The other very important aspect that we'd like to dwell upon is to look at what is the relevance of information lifecycle management and data classification put together for an organization's information security strategy. We will then delve into the aspects of looking at what is that recommended solution approach that an organization needs to undertake for an effective data classification program, what business benefits that an organization can look to see post a successful implementation of a data classification program, and I'd like to leave some key takeaways basis the best practices with respect to data classification. And last but not the least, I'd like to spend some time in talking about the product that we have, which actually helps organizations implement their data classification policy. And therefore, looking at some key features of Classify. Post which I will, have around 5 or 10 minutes for taking questions from the audience. And you can pose those questions through the questionnaire panel on, through the webinar. So let's go ahead. Let's look at what is the real world problem that the organizations are embracing today, because of which data classification has become a need. Data classification has become a pressing issue for organizations to look at. I think everything starts off with data, which is the lifeline of today's business. Businesses create more and more data every day. And what happens with this data? It gets saved, employees move on, data is forgotten, and it's lost. Well, we call this data as that unstructured valuable information that resides on the file servers and document stores. And it remains unprotected, unrecoverable when needed the most. And why so? Because organizations do not know where to find it. So that's the biggest quandary that most of the organizations are facing today. Let's look at something related to it. It is a known fact that information security is as strong as its weakest link, and in most of the cases, the weakest link is the end users, because there are a lot of end users that are not aware of an information security policy or the sensitivity of data within that organization. So what do they really do? I think it is because of that absence of end user awareness that they advertently or inadvertently put unprotected information at risk. Copies of data is made and shared without permission. That leads to information security incidents, breaches, and frauds. And this is one of the major security and data protection challenges that the organizations face today. In these circumstances, let us also look at what happens to technology solutions like data loss prevention that works in monitor and block approaches. They are rendered ineffective because there are too many false positives and there are a lot of security constraints that get into the way of doing business because the data is not structured, the data is not classified. And therefore, let's look at what happens to security and risk professionals like us. We tend to approach data security and focus on controlling access to data without knowing what data are we looking at controlling. We look at approaches that would encrypt data regardless of the importance of data within the organization. And I think it is this approach which is nothing like but building a skyscraper on a weak foundation, because it is overlooking the fundamentals of knowing and understanding your data before you can put controlling mechanisms, before you can secure that data. So therefore, these are real world problems of not having data which is structured, not having a fair bit of understanding of what is the important sensitivity and confidentiality of information, what are the kind of approaches that are required for controlling access to data basis the security. I think the basic fundamental that all the organizations today need to uh, address is understand and know your data and thereof apply protection measures to it. Let's move on and let's look at what is data classification really that we are talking of. I think in the most simplistic terms, data classification is the process of categorizing data which has to be based on its sensitivity, basis its criticality. Let's look at what are the kinds of data in an organization and what is the kind of data classification categories that most of the organizations have. Public, internal, confidential, highly confidential, restricted, and top secrets are the ones that are the industry known terminologies that most of the organizations use to classify data. These are the categories of data. I think we will have a look at the definitions of some of them in order to understand what do they really mean to an organization. As far as data classification policy is concerned, it's quite a framework for protecting information that is critical to the organization and its customers. I think data must be classified according to the risk associated with the data storage, with data processing, and its transmission. And I think written procedures and guidelines for data classification should define the categories like public, internal, and confidential, and the criteria that the organization uses to classify data has to come out very clear. And I think in the subsequent slides, we will look at a typical data classification policy, look at what are the definitions of these categories, and look at some very valid examples, which are going to be helping an organization come up with data classification categories and look at, coming up with a data classification policy thereof. So let's look at the first definition, first categorization of data, which is public. And this is something which is ubiquitous. Every organization has data which is open to general public, right? There is data in every organizations which has no existing restrictions in terms of local, national, or international legal restrictions, and therefore it can be widely shared in the public domain. It is meant for the public domain, and therefore this data is categorized as public. Let's look at some of the examples of public information. Publicly posted press releases of organizations, publicly available marketing brochures and other material that is good for uh, sharing with the people at large outside of the organization, publicly posted job announcements. So I think anything which is unrestricted and can be shared outside of the organization without any fear of any information getting lost. There is no sensitivity or confidentiality which is associated with such information. That is known as public from a classification perspective. Let's move ahead and look at the next level of categorization within an organization, which is internal. I think internal information is an information whose access is restricted to personnel within an organization. It is an information that is not meant for public disclosure. That means any data or information that an organization creates for internal use within the organization with personnel who are designated to whom that information can be shared with is an internal information. Let's look at some of the examples of internal information. Routine office correspondence. not required to be shared outside of the office. Employee newsletters, very specific to the employees of an organization. And so is the internal phone directories, which is very specific to the employees of an organization again. Non-personally identifiable information, that means any information which is not related to an employee of an organization. And organization charts, none of this information, and there are multiple other examples that can actually be drawn up, but I think I wanted to make sure that we actually get some of the examples which will give you an understanding of what is it that is created by the organization, produced by the organization, but not meant for public disclosure. And these are the typical type of information that are categorized as internal to an organization. Let's move on. In fact, one of the important aspects that I'd like to bring to the fore here is that while we move from public to internal to confidential, we are actually this is the increasing order of confidentiality or sensitivity of data that we're looking at. The more the sensitivity or confidentiality of data, the more are going to be stringent measures that are going to be applied to protect that information. So we've actually looked at two such classifications, public, internal. Let's now look at confidential. From a definition standpoint, I think any information which is sensitive in nature that if disclosed outside of the organization without due diligence could negatively impact the operations of an organization. Let's look at some of the examples. Financial information of an organization which doesn't have to go public. This is very internal. Rate cards of an organization are internal to an organization and can jeopardize the business of an organization if it is disclosed to a larger audience outside of the organization. Therefore, umpteen due diligence has to be exhibited by any organization before any such confidential sensitive information is disclosed outside. Vendor contracts, very legal centric document. Customer contracts, again very specific to a customer. The rate card, the contractual obligation signed up with the vendors or customers. This information is extremely critical for an organization not to be disclosed outside. That gets into a confidential category. And so is the case with employee reviews. Now, employee reviews is one example that potentially could be a confidential information, could be an internal information, but obviously this is something which is so very specific to the employees of an organization that it should have no reason to be shared outside. And therefore, it is more confidential and sensitive, and therefore falls into this category. Let's move on and look at another category which is supposed to be the highest category within an organization. Again, while I talk about public, internal, confidential, this is a organization driven terminology, and it depends on organization to organization on how would they want to categorize and give it a name. So these are not hard-coded definitions or categories, but these are intended and provides an guidance to an organization on how a data can be classified within an organization. So let's look at an organization which has information which is protected by statutes or regulations or contracts. This actually is an information that becomes very highly confidential or top secret. It's also referred to as proprietary or restricted, depending on what an organization chooses to pick as a category. Let's look at some of the examples. And I think while you have a look at these examples, any information related to any one of these, if advertently or inadvertently disclosed outside of the organization, can put the organization at the risk of financial damages or penalties or legal damages. And therefore, it is the highest level of information from its criticality standpoint that has to be safeguarded. And as I said, it's protected by statutes. Statute like HIPAA, which governs the medical records, medical history of patients, is a very, very, very important information to be safeguarded at all the times by an organization which is entrusted with patient information, like a healthcare organization or hospitals. Let's look at another category, which is customer credit card information, customer credit card numbers. A statute like a payment card industry data security standard that is governed by. There is huge penalties associated with disclosure of credit card information and any other personally identifiable information of a employee of an organization, which is again guarded by a huge set of regulations in terms of its disclosure, is a highly confidential information of an organization. It's top secret. It is proprietary to that organization. Another set of example, that is duly worth mentioning as far as sensitivity of information is concerned, is intellectual property. If an intellectual property goes in the hands of a competitor, then it can jeopardize the existence of an organization. And therefore, the importance of this kind of information to be classified, to be labeled within an organization. And then commensurating controls need to be put in by an organization depending on the organization's criticality that it associates with that information. So I think with this fundamental understanding of what is data classification, what does it solve for an organization, what are the real world problems that are addressed by a fair bit of understanding of data within an organization, becomes a key for a data classification program implementation. Now, before we actually go into the aspects of looking at, what are the recommended solutions for approaching data classification within an organization and the benefits that it actually brings to an organization, and, what are the key takeaways, let's for a moment look at data classification and its relevance to information lifecycle management. I'm sure each one of you would have come across this popular phrase of cradle to grave, which actually means what is the life of a data or an information within an organization. When I say cradle, that means it gets created. The data gets created within an organization, it gets processed, it gets transmitted, it then gets stored and eventually gets destructed, which is the grave. So data classification is that unique subject that addresses the create phase within an information lifecycle management. Your information lifecycle management is as good as what it has started off when the information got created within an organization. And therefore, data classification helps organizations know what data they have, where the data is located, and how they can access it. I think some of the very important questions that come to our mind, when it gets to looking at data classification is, one, what data types are available? What are the where is that data located? What access levels are implemented? What protection levels are implemented? And do these protection levels adhere to compliance regulations? These are the fundamental questions that we need to get the answers to. And while we have a look at the present state of affairs in various organizations, let's look at some of the wider observations that we make of data classification. Number one, businesses are not aligned to own data classification across organizations. Organizations may have nice, well-to-do formulated data classification policies, but that data is owned by the business in most of the cases. And if the businesses do not align themselves to own the data classification program within an organization, or they do not participate well in data classification programs within an organization, the data classification program can be overambitious. It will be difficult to achieve what it is intended to, and therefore most of the projects fail because of this reason. Most of the projects will disappoint because the businesses are not aligned to own data classification across organizations. Come to think of it, wherever data classification policies and practices do exist, we've also seen that data classification is not followed by all businesses and enabling functions like HR, internal audit, finance, so on and so forth. And I think the most important aspect that we're going to be discussing when we talk about Classify eventually as part of this webinar is technology is not being adopted to enforce data classification policy. And that is what Classify brings to the fore, that it actually provides for that technological bent and help to enforce a data classification policy, which is probably the least effective when implemented in a manual mode. So let's look at very typical potential risks that an organization faces because of non-implementation of effective data classification program. Number one, ineffective use of information protection mechanisms. Look at solutions like data loss prevention or information rights management. I think the effective implementation of DLP and IRM solutions is hinging upon the fact whether data has been classified. I think solutions like DLP and IRM need to be made more intelligent, and they can be made more intelligent to work on their protection mechanisms only if data is classified, and therefore better policies can actually be applied. There are safeguards, that organizations would employ, which would not commensurate with the criticality or sensitivity of data because the data has not been classified. And therefore, what happens is that organizations have a tendency to suffer from legal and contractual compliance failures because of non-availability of that ability to discover data and classify data and put protection means that commensurate with the criticality of the information. And that also leads to information security incidents and breaches. Let's further move on and now look at some of the recommended solution approaches that we think are very important that can help any organization address data classification and make a data classification program effective. Number one, address data classification by classifying data with which you can regain control over unstructured data. I think we talked about the real life problem that the organizations are facing of unstructured data. Regain control over unstructured data by classifying data. I think when you classify data, it can reduce the risks because businesses can retrieve information more easily and identify more accurately the protection mechanisms that are needed to be employed for a specific data within an organization, whereby they can look at reducing the risk of costly data leakages and therefore increasing the efficiency of the business. Once you have once you've actually looked at addressing data classification, you've classified data, you've had a data classification policy, you should choose the right fit data classification approach by making sure that you are involving the end users in classifying the information and use automated classification means such as Classify or the other solutions that are there in the marketplace, with which you can actually help the end users by providing them with a technology solution and help them in their classification decisions. And as I said, involvement of the end users is extremely important. Involvement of the business users is extremely important. It is the user who understands what is the criticality of information and therefore is in a position to classify the information based on the data classification policy within an organization. Involve end users in data classification. make them more data aware is the key. I think with this approach, the end users can achieve greater understanding of the business's information security policies and are able to value data, which becomes, uh, the rock bed of a data classification program within an organization. It is needless to say that any data classification program or any other program within an organization will require a top-down approach. A tone has to be set at the top. Executive management participation is as important as the end user participation. And I think with data classification, which deals with data to the core, end users involvement is the key to any successful implementation of a data classification program within any organization. Let's move on and look at what are the business benefits that an organization achieves. I think first and foremost is the strategic advantage. The strategic reason for establishing a data classification program is to enjoy the higher degree of trust, build a higher degree of trust with your customers. That is the biggest strategic advantage that an organization can accrue of having established a data classification program. I think this is one of the better means of showcasing that an organization is a security and compliance conscious service provider, because it understands its data, it understands the data which is it may be dealing on behalf of a customer, and is able to put securing and controlling measures which commensurate with the sensitivity and criticality of data. And what it really does to an organization eventually is that it brings clarity to the business. It helps organization define data protection measures, which is akin to the data sensitivity. What it really helps is you helps an organization fund and put its fund and resources and do the right set of allocation to defend the assets, because it really understands which data needs more protection than the other. I think employing a data classification scheme is also cost effective for organizations in the longer run, because it allows a business to focus on protecting its higher data assets before anything else. As we've talked about the aspect of making DLP and other perimeter security devices and data archiving solutions more intelligent, this is what data classification program does to an organization. It leads to enhancement of effectiveness of data protection and storage technologies, thereby reducing the risk of expensive data breaches. And last but not the least is facilitates organizations and businesses meet specific data protection and regulatory requirements, which could also be contractual requirements that today the organizations sign with their customers and vendors. And the most important aspect of all that we have been enforcing upon is that end user participation, that any DLP, that any data classification program really gets to an organization. It involves the end user. It helps promote the culture of information security by involving the end user and having an end user realize the responsibility and that they have for the organization. So it increases the user awareness of their organization's information security policy, and therefore this becomes the key. Let's move on and look at some of the key takeaways from the webinar for today. There are two key takeaways that I'd like to leave the audience with. Number one, do your groundwork before you do any implementation of controlling measures, protecting measures like IRM, data loss prevention, and the others. Define your data. I think you should begin defining your data, break it down, analyze data, and then defend it. At the end of the day, we've got to make sure that we give every data its identity, which will then enable actionable data security and control policies. So define your data. That's the key. Have a data classification policy, data classification categories within an organization. And number two, whilst you are setting up this data classification policy, keep it simple. I think define a data classification policy to address the entire life cycle of an information within an organization, right from its creation to its destruction. Please understand, not all information has the same value to an organization. Different classes of information represent different risks with respect to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Therefore, classifying information helps to ensure that appropriate levels of policies, controls, and resources are in place, and that these investments deliver an appropriate level of value to the business in return. And last but not the least, the key is to classify newer data first, and then you could take up legacy data. If you're embarking on any data classification journey, look at the data that you're creating now, and then look at your legacy data thereafter. So I think that really brings us, to the end of the subject of data classification and its importance and the way it should be approached within an organization. Let's now, for the next 5 minutes, look at the solution that we bring to the fore that really helps organizations manage their data risk of data not being structured, data not being classified, data not being labeled. And that is where the solution, as in Classify, comes to the fore. So what does Classify really do? If you have a look at this slide, it takes care of emails in terms of labeling, and it takes care of Microsoft Office documents in PDF. Classify obviously will have further enhancements with respect to its feature set, but today what it really brings to an organization is the ability to classify, label Microsoft Office documents while they are being created, PDF documents while they are being created and before they're getting saved. And any email that gets created, designed before it is sent out to the external world or the internal organization, it gets labeled. So what does Classify really does? I really talked about the fact that it does labeling and it does visual marking on the headers, footers, and provides watermarking to Microsoft Office documents. It provides for labeling on the header, footer, and subjects when the emails are designed or created. So therefore, it really works on the concept of meta tagging, metadata tagging. If you look at the advanced properties of Microsoft Office document, which has actually been used to create a document using Classify, the metadata will talk about that classification, whether it is public, internal, confidential, top secret, restricted, so you will. And so does that metadata tagging of the data classification scheme or categorization in an organization also happens in the X header of the emails. So therefore, any document that gets created or any email that gets created will always bear a meta tag of the data classification scheme or label that the organization follows. And therefore, data protection measures, which is commensurating with the sensitivity of that data, can actually be applied. What Classify also brings as a very important aspect is the logging of information. When a Microsoft Office document gets created, you can actually go to the advanced properties of that document and you could see who is the person who actually created that information and what is the kind of tagging that he actually provide to that document. If that document actually gets shared with somebody else and someone else were to do a reclassification, an audit log would also get created for that transaction. What other important aspects and features that Classify really gets is that it actually helps blacklisting and whitelisting of email domains. Any domain that you do not deem necessary or warranted to send that email to send organizations email to, that domain can be blacklisted using Classify. So I think these are the very important features of Classify as a product. It actually helps you do labeling, visual marking on Office documents, PDFs, and your Microsoft Outlook, as in your email. And the fundamental that it really works on is metadata tagging. And it has a very powerful reporting and a logging engine in which you could see how many users are having Classify on their systems, how many licenses do you really have for Classify, what is the set of documents, how many documents in this organization are classified as public, how many documents are classified as internal, and the other levels of classification. It actually helps do the blacklisting and whitelisting of email domains and has data loss prevention features as well. So in a nutshell, data classification framework within an organization can actually be enforced using a product and a solution like Classify. And Classify works well with various different OEM solutions on DLP and information rights management, and really helps make those solutions work more effectively by making them more intelligent. So therefore, Classify really sits very tight between an organization's information security data classification framework, and it very seamlessly ties up with the already invested in solutions like DLP or information rights management within an organization. It really actually makes that environment more intelligent by ensuring that any data which is more critical is having more commensurate data protection mechanisms within an organization. Well, this is a representation wherein any document which is getting created, let's say this document which is getting created within an organization and gets saved by the user, Classify will sit on the client of the user machine, and when he tries to save the document, there would be a pop-up that comes on the screen that will enforce the user to select the classification level of the document. If you look at the classification levels, public, confidential, internal, the befitting classification level will have to be selected by the user before the document can be saved. And you could also see that the user can actually choose whether he would like to have the label on header, footer, or he would also want to have a watermark of that data classification scheme to be mentioned in that document before the document gets saved. This is a dashboard of what we call as the Classify Manager, which really is the reporting and the logging engine. That is what I alluded to. At any given point in time, you can actually see the number of documents with respect to their classification. You can actually see who are the top 5 users who have really classified the data within an organization. You could also see how many events are there within an organization wherein a data classification scheme was lowered. And these are important aspects that the administrators or the compliance teams within an organization, security professors within an organizations are really interested in knowing. And therefore, this rock solid compliance feature within the Classify solution and the tool is paramount. And the next slide really talks about the various logging features that are available within Classify. Any document that gets created, there is an audit trail, there is a log that gets generated to say who created that information, which IP address was used, to create that information, what is the classification label, what is the classification type for that information, and it also provides for a classification, that it also provides for a unique identification number for that document that remains with the document from the time that it gets created. And therefore, in order to find out where that document is today, how many copies of that document have actually been created, it can easily be retrieved, because that classification identification number that get associated with the document always remains with that document throughout the life cycle till such time that that document is destroyed within an organization. Well, with this, I'd like to thank each one of you for a very patient listening. And now I throw open the forum for any questions that the team would have. So I think there's a question that has come up, from one of the participants. It actually says, where do you see data related to an organization which is generated by entities outside the organization? That is data generated through social media. Where does this data fit into the scheme of things? I think if an organization has not created any information by the use of their employees or their management, that data does not belong to the organization. If an organization, if an data related to the organization has gotten created by someone outside the organization, that data would not belong to that organization, and therefore that is a public information, that is a public data, because that got created outside of the organization, outside of the realm of the organization, outside of the control of the organization. There's another question that has come in which says, how do we classify the documents that have already been created? This is what I had alluded to as legacy information, something which has already been created within an organization. I think there is a concept which is known as bulk classification. Classify also provides for that option to an organization wherein they can choose all the data which has, from a legacy standpoint, been created in the past, and all those documents can actually be collated together and they can be bulk classified. That means you can actually pick up all the information that you deem is internal to an organization or should be classified as internal, or you can pick up all the information, bucket them together, that you think should be labeled as confidential. There is a bulk classification feature that products like Classify provide, by which you can classify legacy information. There's another question that is inquiring to see if Classify works with Lotus Notes email client. I think Classify really works with Microsoft Outlook at this point. As far as Lotus Notes is concerned, I think there are some templatized features available within Lotus Notes for the classification of emails. But as far as most of the tools on data classification are concerned, they largely work with Microsoft Office, which is, the de facto Microsoft, the de facto email solution that most of the organizations are using. The question, is with respect to whether data classification solutions support Android and iPhone and Windows Phone. I think the answer is yes. As far as the journey of Classify is concerned today, it only is in a position to help an organization classify their emails. But as a product roadmap, we are looking at extending Classify to work with Android, iPhone, and Outlook Web Access. So therefore, in terms of the next year roadmap, which is this year roadmap, the next 1 year roadmap, all these features in Classify will be available. Then there is a question which comes in from a participant which says, what about data classification resides in database server? I think the question doesn't come out very clear, but I assume that the question really means what about the databases, and classification thereof. I think as of now, it is the Microsoft Office documents and the PDFs that are covered. There are other known file types that Classify will cover as far as data labeling is concerned. There could be certain proprietary databases in which connectors will have to be written, but in terms of popular database structures like Microsoft SQL and the others, I think Classify can provide for that connectors, but that will be on a very specific request of an organization. Otherwise, the number of connectors can actually be infinite, and therefore, depending on the very specific need of an organization, Classify can definitely provide for extended features for providing data classification on databases as well. So this really gets me to the end of the questions, that were there on the question board, and I wish you all the very best. If you're looking at having any plans for any data classification related policy enforcement or data classification programs within your organization. If there are any questions that you may have, please feel free to write into me. My email ID is tarun@classify.in. You also have my mobile number, on this slide. So feel free to get in touch with me in case you have any specific questions outside of this session. And I wish all of you all the very best. And thank you all for a very patient listening.